Smoke it, sell it, tax it. Why not, right? That may be the new slogan for Uruguay as the country prepares to vote tomorrow on legislation that would legalize marijuana on a national level. It's a huge step. Uruguay would actually become the first country to allow the production, sale, and distribution of marijuana. Drug Policy Alliance Executive Director Ethan Nadelman joins us now with more on this potentially historic decision. You know, Ethan, this legislation comes straight from the president himself. Why is he pushing so hard for this?
You know, it seems like there's basically two reasons. The first was he asked his advisors, what's the smartest way to deal with marijuana in the country? And his advisors say, well, the smartest, most sensible policy would be to legally regulate it and tax it. And I think he said, well, let's just do it. And I think politically speaking, President Mujica understands that this is an issue of great significance, actually, to young people in the country. And I think that youthful perspective is very important to him when he thinks about the future of Uruguay. Well,
you know, certainly, I mean, he's made some very bold moves. He legalized gay marriage, now this. Now, as I look at this proposed legislation, it kind of reminds me of what we've seen around the country in various places like Mendocino County, for example, at least on a municipal level, because registered users are going to be able to buy up to 40 grams a month from a limited number of pharmacies. Registered growers are going to be allowed to grow up to 6 plants. Co-ops with 45 members can grow up to 99 plants. Sounds a bit to me, and I'm curious if you agree, like some of the regulation we've seen in place at the municipal level throughout the country.
Well, I'll tell you, Trish, I mean, it really is a whole hybrid. I mean, you look what you've seen with the regulation of medical marijuana in the various states around the U.S. You look what Washington and Colorado are planning right now. You look what some of the Europeans are doing. So this Uruguay model where you can grow up to 6 plants in the privacy of your home, that's like Colorado. The model where you have a cooperative where 40 or 50 people can designate one person to grow on a non-profit basis, that's like Spain. The system where you have the pharmacies as the way to legally sell this stuff, that's a little bit like the alcohol regulation model in Colorado and Washington. So I think what they're trying to do in Uruguay is come up with the best model, you know, one that reassures their neighbors like, you know, Argentina and Brazil that there's not going to be major exports. They're not allowing people from outside the country to buy.
Right, I saw that. It's illegal to sell to foreigners. So they're not going to have any tourism.
No, I don't think so. I think what they're trying to do is to find that sweet spot where you regulate it tightly enough so that you reassure people, your neighbors, doesn't get out of control. But on the other hand, don't regulate it so tightly that actually you make a mockery or a farce of legal regulation.
Well, and you also have to be careful because of pricing. If you regulate it too tightly, what you're going to wind up doing, of course, is driving this back underground. You know, one other thing that struck me, Ethan, 3.4 million people live in Uruguay. So it's, you know, basically half the size of the population of Washington State, a state that has legalized marijuana for recreational purposes here in the U.S. What's the difference trying to implement something in a country of 3.4 million versus, you know, if you look at trying to do it on the national level here, just the challenge of the sheer size of the United States of America makes it a very different proposition, I imagine.
Well, I mean, basically, Colorado's got, what, 4 million people, Washington State a little more than that. So I think if you're looking at Uruguay, Washington, Colorado, more or less the same. I think the bigger challenge is something like the United States, where you have 50 states, 50 different state legal systems, you have federal law. That makes it a lot more challenging. But I'll tell you, the bigger impact here, in the same way that when Colorado and Washington voted to legalize marijuana last year, it had a catalytic impact on public opinion around the country. So you saw this Gallup poll last month where support nationally for legalizing marijuana jumped from 48% a year ago to 58% now. I think the same thing is going to happen with Uruguay. Uruguay does this. Tomorrow they vote. President Mujica signs it shortly thereafter. And then what's going to happen is public opinion around Latin America, other parts of the world, is going to step back and watch this thing playing out. And they're going to realize that, you know, legally regulating this stuff, it's a real option. There are countries doing it. Why don't we do the same instead of persisting
and
with the failed prohibition policies?
And there could be some momentum there. I mean,
the
we've seen a number of former presidents, from the former president of Mexico to the former president of Brazil, Cardoso, who was here on set with Adam and I talking about the importance of legalizing drugs in general, including marijuana, to try and deal with some of the crime issues that the region faces. So you're right, the region could start to look to Uruguay as an example of all this. I'm curious about, the business opportunity. Being a business network, a lot of people have estimated this at being as much as a $10 to $100 billion a year industry. I spoke with one marijuana entrepreneur out in Seattle who's looking at Uruguay very closely and was spending some time there because he saw this as an opportunity for him to source marijuana out of Uruguay, bring it to other countries and sell it overseas. Do you think that there will be much commercial enterprise, Ethan, built around marijuana in Uruguay?
Not so much in Uruguay. I think they're very keen to make this very much a local thing. Even as we see not just former presidents, but current presidents like Santos in Colombia or Otto Pérez Molina in Guatemala talking about changing global drug policy, in Uruguay, President Mujica and his government really focus on this as a domestic thing. So down the road, when marijuana is legally taxed and regulated around the country, that's going to be an industry worth tens of billions of dollars. And we'll see the same thing around Europe and eventually around Latin America. But I think right now that Uruguayan market is going to be relatively modest. The principal market impact will be to reduce the import of illegal marijuana from Paraguay to Uruguay.
Okay.
That'll be the basic
Final
impact.
question, just 10 seconds. We're bringing it back home. We know Washington has legalized it for recreational purposes. We know Colorado has, and that's going to go into effect in the beginning of 2014. What state, Ethan, is next?
Yeah, or keep your eye on Oregon for November 2014, maybe Alaska. Keep your eye on D.C. and California. We'll know more about it in a couple of months.